Hi, and welcome to today's episode of Piano TV. We are doing a Q&A session, which I like to do every month. I like to pick 4 of your questions, usually in a diverse range, whether they have to do with like technique or learning piano or whatever it happens to be, and answer them as best as I can. I'm just one piano teacher, and I just have the one opinion, so don't take things I say as law, but I mean, I try to help where I can. Anyway, this is turning into a long introduction. Let's get started. Question number 1 is actually something I've been asked before. I can see that sometimes your fingertips tend to bend the other way. I heard that this broken fingertip thing isn't good for sound, as I tend to do the same. I would like to know if I should correct it or ignore it. This is something that I actually never noticed until I received a couple comments about it on YouTube. I don't actually ever recall a teacher bringing it up to my attention either. So finger collapsing, it's kind of hard to just spontaneously demonstrate it, but instead of pressing the notes with like a curve, the fingers kind of like bend back on themselves. Sometimes I see serious finger collapsing in children, but not usually in adults. Like for some children, it's almost like they haven't developed some type of crucial coordination. And what I usually find is that this often just corrects itself in a year or so, especially with emphasizing a proper hand shape. However, after doing a fair amount of preliminary research on this topic, and I'll leave a link to the some really good information I read, I'll leave a link over on the blog. My overall conclusion is that it's probably something that's worth looking into correcting with like a strongly marked asterisk. So from my perspective, I haven't actually encountered any real issues with this. Like I've been playing piano for 2 decades and I haven't really come across more than that actually, wow. But yeah, I haven't noticed any, it hasn't really gotten in my way. It might be something that holds me back from like the next level of advanced piano playing. But up until now, it hasn't been a real problem for me. And I also suspect that some famous performers might also have a little bit of finger collapsing when they play. It just kind of, like if you watch their fingers really closely, it's hard to tell sometimes. So I was watching Horowitz and I was watching Yu Wang, and I noticed that their outer fingers kind of look like they're doing that a little bit. So I don't really have like a definitive final answer for you. If it's a really severe, like if your fingers are constantly doing this the whole time, then that's a big problem. But it hasn't really gotten in my way. The best explanation of finger collapsing that I've read is this. If we get used to pressing in the keys in the way where we pull back our fingers as we press, those knuckle joints tend to collapse. But if we press the keys with more of a forward, kind of like almost like a diagonal motion, the fingers maintain their structure. Anyway, I've kind of talked about this enough. I know it's not like a super in-depth answer. I don't think I've answered your question really at all, except for just speculating. But again, go over to the blog if you want to see the article I linked that has really in-depth information on how to correct it if you're concerned about it. The next question is kind of like a 2-in-1. I kind of merged 2 questions. So the first one is, how do I successfully play classical style legato, as in what you find in Haydn or Mozart? And then building on that, this person's complaining that their teacher said, make it brighter. What does that mean? Does it mean more separation? Though it should be connected for some phrases. Feels like a challenge to be a bouncy, bright piano that still sound a bit like harpsichord, yet are introducing legato. So they're talking kind of about the original instruments that people in the classical era played on. This question is kind of a 2-in-1. So how to play legato, and also how to alter the tone within that legato sound. As far as I know, the playing of legato is basically the same, whether you're playing classical music, romantic music, modern music, because in its simplest definition, it means to play the notes smoothly and connected. When you're playing classical music, the most important thing with legato playing is that you pay attention to where the legato is marked, and especially where it isn't. So when you're following the slurs, that's literally telling you where to hold and where to play smoothly. And it's also telling you, okay, well, don't play this smooth, don't play this smooth. And that lifting is really important. Piano students sometimes have the tendency to just play everything smooth. They see a slur and it all gets smooth, and there ends up being like, instead of a nice break there, we kind of end up with like a giant slur merging all those parts together. But you really, really want to obey these breaks in the slurs as well, because they contribute to the sound just as much as the smooth playing itself does. Another thing you might want to think about when you're playing legato is how to make the passage sound lifelike. So say you have a nice long slur. I just tried to think of something off the top of my head. I guess that's not a particularly long slur. But if you play them all the same volume, like playing it all in a flat line, it just ends up sounding a little inhuman. So good legato playing means that you not only want to play the notes smooth, but you also want to look for natural variances in the sound, or kind of like a rising and falling. So that's really the essence of legato playing, whether it be classical music, modern music, whatever. You want to keep the notes smooth and connected. You want to pay attention to the breaks between the slurs, and you also want to have some movement within the slurs. Now, in terms of altering the tone of the notes, like playing them brighter, this requires some subtle adjustments and a little bit of trial and error. How you press the keys is gonna alter the tone of what they end up sounding like in really minor ways. If we press the keys really heavily, your tone is gonna be heavier. Even if I play quietly, I'll see if I can show you what I mean. I'm gonna press into the keys heavily, but also play fairly quiet. It still ends up with like a little bit of a thunky sound. But if you keep your hand shape raised and you play from your fingertips and press lightly, you're gonna have a lighter tone overall. And generally, classical music sounds best with this lifted sound. So just make sure your wrist is staying up and level with your hand. Make sure your fingers are relaxed and that you don't lean into the notes too much. This is something that you really just want to personally experiment with to figure out, because the physical differences in playing are really subtle, but it does make a big difference in the overall sound. The third question is, how can I look at the sheet music if I need to look down? I am so glad you asked this question. There we go again with, I'm very self-violent apparently in my passion for answering these questions. Anyway, this is something that comes up fairly often in my studio, and I've never really talked about it before. The simple answer, short answer is don't look at your hands. Because what can end up happening if we're reading our music and then we look at our hands, we're kind of like doing this, and it's really disorienting. I joke to my students that they're gonna get whiplash, because you're more apt to lose your place when you're doing that, right? Like if you kind of take your eyes off the sheet music, suddenly your eyes have to like refocus and find that spot again. So ideally, when you're reading music, you don't want to look at your hands at all, unless like for the occasional leap or something. When I notice my students do this, I take a great big piano book and cover their view of their hands so they can't see. And then I get them to play the same thing again without being able to actually look at their fingers. Even if their eyes glance down, they don't get to see their fingers. And they almost always play better than before when I do this. They play with fewer pauses. They don't actually struggle with where their fingers should go, because they can kind of feel it out. For distances up to an octave, you really don't need to look at your hands at all. You should be able to feel those distances. And if you can't, that's something that you should start working on. Well, relying on sight is obviously a really important thing when you're playing an instrument. Obviously, you want to use that. But it's also important to rely on tactile sensations and getting a feel for distances and stuff. So even if I'm playing something with like large leaps, what I try to do is I try to train my tactile memory to it, so then when I'm playing I can look, but I can also feel the distance, so I'm not relying solely on my sight. So to sum up, if you're playing something from memory, okay, you can look at your hands. But if you're reading sheet music, try your absolute best to just keep your eyes on the music and not look down unless you absolutely need to. So for the final question today, Aiden's asking, I had to stop taking piano lessons midway through grade 6 because of monetary reasons. I still want to continue to learn the piano, become better at it, but without the weekly lesson and fearing my teacher will scold me for not practicing. I'm having trouble finding motivation, especially when it comes to keeping up with technicals, probably meaning things like scales. Any tips for staying motivated? I eventually want to get back into lessons, and I don't want to have to start from a lower grade due to lack of practice. We have talked about motivation a little bit on the channel already. We've done an hour-long inspiration session. We've done a video that was called something like how to stay motivated at the piano when the going gets tough. You can check out those if you want to get a little bit more into it. And we'll probably keep doing videos about motivation because it's such an important topic and so many people struggle with it. And the reality is, is motivation is going to wax and wane, and you're not always going to be able to take piano lessons, especially if you're planning on learning piano for the long term. It's not realistic to assume you'll be able to take piano lessons uninterrupted for 10 years. If you can, great, but most of us can't. My cat is eating the handle. Did she just move the camera? I know you're hungry. I also really want to clear one thing up. You will not have to start at a lower grade level. That shouldn't be a concern. I've seen students go like a year or two without playing with virtually no change to their level after like, you know, an hour or two of touching up. Other piano teachers might balk at this suggestion, but it's not the end of the world if you just don't do scales and stuff for a little while. One thing that I oscillate on is I really like to do etudes, because etudes still develop your technique, but they are a little bit more interesting because they sound like actual pieces. So that could be something you might want to try. So for me, I always need a little bit of structure when I'm not taking piano lessons. I need to kind of give that structure to myself. So I'll usually sit down and come up with a rough year-long plan. And then I'll take that year-long plan and figure out what do I need to do in the next 3 months or so to get me closer to that year goal. And then I'll break those into smaller goals that I can accomplish on a weekly and monthly basis. Performance goals are probably the most motivating for the most people. Even if you're not in a community where you could just like go out and perform at random, most of us aren't going to do that. One thing that I think is really fun is to build like a mini recital. So maybe learn 5 or 6 pieces and say like set a date for 3 months in the future where you just do like a mini show for your friends and family. Most people love that. Like, it's super fun. I really like listening to my own musician friends play, and that's just a good way to give yourself like a real goal because you have something that people are going to be expecting. I also really like playing in bands because when you're with a group, there's, again, more people aside from yourself, so it helps keep you accountable. And there are also online communities if none of those are an option for you. So Piano World is really good about doing online recitals, which are like huge things. Like, there's tons of videos that get submitted, but you can basically like join a recital, say what piece you're gonna play, and then like post your video playing it, and that might be a cool way to motivate yourself. Anyway, hopefully these suggestions are getting the gears turning, and do check out the other videos I mentioned. I will link them in the blog as well. And that is all for today's Q&A video. As always, feel free to leave any questions that you want answered in the comments below. What I usually do when I do the next month's Q&A is I'll go and look at the video or comments from the previous Q&A and select the ones that I think will be relevant to more people, or that I have like an ability to answer to some degree. Sometimes you guys ask questions and I just don't know. So those are the ones that I usually ignore. Anyway, I'm going to let you go, which sounds like I'm talking to you on the phone because it's hot and sweaty, and I have to turn off the AC when I record because it's really, really loud, and you already have to deal with my neighbors yelling in the background probably. So, okay, catch you in the next video. Hi, and welcome to this month's, that was a loud leg slap. Let's try that again. Hi, and welcome to